And believe it or not, they asked me to write AJ's interview. And she goes, well, what did you tell him? So I told them, no, it was too much work. And she came around and looked at me, and she's not a race fan, but she knows who AJ Foyt is. And she goes, how do you tell AJ Foyt no? And the more I thought about it, I said, all right, I'll give it a go. I knew it was going to be a lot. I didn't know it was going to be this much, but I knew it was going to be a lot. And it's been a great ride. AJ talks about after winning his fourth 500 in 1977, his dad said he'd driven a fair race. And AJ said that's about the nicest thing he's ever said about it. So there was not a lot of praise, but there's certainly a huge amount of support. Even talking to drivers and people who I know had clashed with AJ in the past, it was nothing but love at this point. It was tough to find anybody to say anything negative about the legend. Mario did the forward, and I think that's one example. It was nothing. Heart of gold, I think, is what he said about AJ. It was hard to find anybody to say anything negative about him. Hi, I'm Art Garner, author of AJ Foyt, Survivor, Champion, Legend, and this is Cars and Culture with Jason Stein.
An absolute pleasure to have a fellow member of the automotive, one-time media corps, also from the automaker side on the program, but most importantly, an author. And congratulations on the publication of Volume 1 of the book on AJ Foyt. Art, welcome into the program.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for having me.
I know you're a listener to the show, but you are our first author, and so we have a lot of. I have a lot of respect for what you've done, but I want to start with the fact that this was 5 years of your life, Art? And did I understand it correctly? It was every day, Christmas, New Year's, birthdays, anniversaries for 5 years. Is that right?
Yes, sir. Every day, COVID was in the middle of that.
Right.
So basically I had nothing else to do, but every day except for one, I had my prostate out. And the day after that, I didn't do anything, but every other day I was at work on this biography.
That's amazing. Why did you want to write a book about AJ Foyt?
Well, it didn't start out that way, at least not in 2019 when I started. I had done a book called Black Noon about the 1964 Indy 500, and where a couple drivers were killed, Eddie Sachs, Dave McDonald, and AJ happened to win that race. So I'd interviewed him before for that book. And when that was done in 2015, I reached out and said, hey, I'd like to do a bio on AJ, and didn't hear back from him at all. And it wasn't until 4 years later when I was writing a different book about racing in 1967 when I went to interview him in Houston. The next day, they asked me, would you want to do the bio of AJ now? And I said, no, that's way too much work. No, I'm not interested. Went home. My wife asked me, hey, how'd the interview go? I said, it was great. And believe it or not, they asked me to write AJ's interview. And she goes, well, what did you tell him? So I told them, no, it was too much work. And she came around and looked at me, and she's not a race fan, but she knows who AJ Foyt is. And she goes, how do you tell AJ Foyt no? And the more I thought about it, I said, all right, I'll give it a go. I knew it was going to be a lot. I didn't know it was going to be this much, but I knew it was going to be a lot. And it's been a great ride.
Yeah, I knew that it would be a lot. I mean, the point with AJ Foyt, who we'll get into his many, many accomplishments, but it's almost a where do you start, right, Art?
Absolutely. When he was 5 years old or 6 years old, I can't remember. He ran his first race.
Right.
And his dad was a midget racer, and his earliest memories are sitting in his dad's garage, listening to street racers or listening to race talk, bench racing talk. So yeah, it starts literally on day one.
Well, so you decide that this is what you're going to do. To this point, what's out there that was definitive about AJ Foyt? In other words, how could you separate yourself from other things that have been written about this legendary race car driver?
There were a couple bios early on. One that came out in '67, I think, and another one right around 1980. But nothing since then. No real biography since then. Partly because AJ didn't want to cooperate with it. You know,
Mm-hmm.
he didn't want to deal with it. And even those early bios were, you know, they weren't very factual. They were more glorifying of AJ than anything else. One was an autobiography that one reviewer said, I kept waiting for the point where AJ actually walked on water. You know, it took a lot of heat. It's entertaining. It's a good read, but it's over the top. And that's one thing I made clear with this was one, I didn't want to do an autobiography. I wanted to do a legitimate biography, and it had to be everything, the good and the bad.
Yeah, of which there are plenty. I mean, Anthony Joseph Tony Foyt, who is not a spring chicken. I mean, he just turned 90.
Correct. Yep.
So you approach him and say, "This is what we're going to do," and how does that go?
And, you know, and most of it goes through his uh, marketing and public relations people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, by the time I sit down with AJ, you know, we're just doing an interview. There's no back and forth with him. That's mostly through his PR and marketing folks.
Right, right. But how did some of those initial conversations go with him? I mean, you've got to start some from somewhere, and tell me about some of the early hours spent with him.
Yeah, and he was always gracious with his time, very accommodating. On some occasions, I realized that you know we were pushing the limit, and maybe I needed to back off and wait for another day, which I did. But the early discussions, you know, and basically I went through mainly a chronological order. I said, let's start at the beginning.
Hmm.
He loves talking about his mom and dad. You know, totally devoted to both, especially his father. So we just basically started at the beginning. He's got a wall of photos in his shop that they can take you out and show you different things from his past, from his history. He's got the original Foyt brothers garage photos on the wall. So it's a pretty impressive display, and he'll go on and on. He likes talking about what happened in the past. The further back, the better, I think, most times.
Yeah, right. His father was such an inspiration to him, and really sort of drove a lot of AJ's or was the result of the drive that AJ had. Correct. Uh,
Absolutely.
Tell me about the relationship between AJ and his father.
You know, it's a typical Depression era. He was born 1935. Depression era relationship. A stoic father. He lost both his parents before he was 20 years old. His mom Evelyn had lost her father very early. So it was. They were both committed to giving their children a better family atmosphere. And that's what they did. But you know, he was a typical stoic 1930s type of guy who didn't hand out much praise. You know, there were no participation trophies given out back then, that's for sure.
Tough love.
And yeah, absolutely. And you know, after AJ talks about after winning his fourth 500 in 1977, his dad said he'd driven a fair race.
Hmm.
And AJ said, that's about the nicest thing he's ever said about me. So there was not a lot of praise, but there's certainly a huge amount of support.
Yeah, it was all about impressing his father, wasn't it? And that really drove AJ.
Absolutely. He was committed to showing his father what he could do, that he could be a winner. Because that's what was expected. His dad drove, but never was a winner. He never had the money to build a top level car or the time to vote.
Right.
But once he became AJ's crew chief, especially, that really drove AJ to show his dad what he could do.
In the retelling of some stories that AJ shared with you, what did you feel was what were the areas where he was most proud of what had happened in his racing career?
Victories and winning is everything to AJ. And the wins that he had with his dad and his mom there. In fact, when he was talking about the 77 race, because I've asked him numerous times, what are the highlights of your career? And there are different ones. Just qualifying for the first Indy 500 in 1958, he said was a huge part of his career. But most often than not, it came to settle on the 77 race was his biggest event. And he had tears in his eyes when he was saying, I won with my own car, my own engine. My dad was my crew chief. That's when he got tears in his eyes and said, and my mom were both still alive. So impressing them when they were still around was a key for him.
You didn't hide. Also, the other side of this is that you didn't hide much in the book. His dad famously said that sometimes working with AJ can be like dancing with a buzzsaw. A real son of a gun, as it's written. Is he still a son of a gun?
He was a real son of a gun and proud of it. He didn't hide it. He was proud of it. No, he's not. At times he can be. He's mellowed a lot, I'm told. But at times he can be, and I've seen him in the garage in Indianapolis where he is upset about something. And then 5 minutes later, he's the nicest guy in the world, which is something that dated back to when he was actually running the team and driving. He could rip one of his crew members apart one moment and next minute be having a beer with him. And the crew guys have told me, if you could take that, if you could handle that, it was a great, great experience. But not everybody was capable of handling that.
Did he acknowledge that he was that?
Oh yeah, he knows, and he said it many times. Maybe I'm a son of a gun. I know I'm a son of a gun, but it's my butt in the seat too. And if somebody in the crew screws up, that's my life on the line out there. So he was not willing to allow that to happen. Early on, let me see, it would have been 2021, I guess. I was in Indianapolis, and they were having a car celebrating the 1961 winner. And the final lone remaining crew member from that race was there. Took pictures with AJ. He was in the original uniform that the pit crew had worn at the race. And then afterwards, AJ barely talked to the guy. And somebody, after the guy left, somebody asked him, hey, how come you didn't talk to him? He goes, that son of a gun left my wheel off in 1962. So, and not those words, but that's what he meant. And so, he's still one who remembers and still can be a son of a gun at different times. The only time he got mad at me was when I tried to pay for lunch one day. I went over, hey, Jay, you've bought lunch a couple times. Let me get this one. He goes, give me that blank check, and he wasn't going to allow me to pay for lunch.
Wow. Still a fire.
Yeah.
He drove in the Indianapolis 500 for 35 consecutive years, was the first of only 4 to win it 4 times. The only driver to have won the Indy 500 in both the front and rear engine cars. Did it twice with both configurations. The only driver to have won the 24-hour of Le Mans with Dan Gurney and the Indy 500 in the same year. And the only person to have recorded victories in the Indy 500, the Daytona 500, the 24 hours of Daytona, the 24-hour of Le Mans, the 12 hours of Sebring. But yet, an incredibly insecure guy. Tell me about that.
Yeah, absolutely. To him, you're only as good as your last victory. And if he lost a couple of races, he was tearing the crew apart, looking for more, horsepower from the engine, trying to do something with the chassis, looking for the latest, greatest thing that might be available as far as a new car or something like that. Absolutely. He was driven for victory. And when he didn't win, he was as mean a son of a gun as you could find.
Wow. And yet all these talented individuals, the Wayne Gretzky's of the world, the Michael Jordans, the AJ Foyts, they're all somewhat reclusive to some extent, right? They are They are lauded for who they are and what they can do in that arena. And yet outside of that arena, they're sort of everyday, like I said, reclusive folks. You'd put him in that category, having spent time personally around him?
Oh, you bet. He strove for the limelight his entire career. But then when he was in it, he backed away. He didn't like signing autographs. Most of the time, he said he was just too busy. He was working on cars. He really just liked talking with the media. But when the media went to somebody else, like a Mario Andretti, who was much more receptive, AJ would get upset. So yeah, he sought the limelight, but when he got it, he backed away from it. And part of the Jekyll and Hyde personality, I guess, that he had.
Right, right. You interviewed several very interesting folks as a part of this whole effort. Speaking of Mario Andretti, Roger Penske, Al Unser Sr., Johnny Rutherford, Jackie Stewart, Richard Petty, Cale Yarborough, many others. The overall feeling about AJ was what?
Even talking to drivers and people who I know had clashed with AJ in the past, it was nothing but love at this point. It was tough to find anybody to say anything negative about the legend. Mario did the forward, and I think that's one example. It was nothing. Heart of gold, I think, is what he said about AJ. It was hard to find anybody to say anything negative about him. And even those who did would preface it with, I love AJ. He was wonderful to me. There were several instances they might point out where they had clashed. But for the most part, nothing but good feeling towards AJ now. The guy's 9 years old and he is a legend, no doubt. So it's hard to find anybody to say something negative about a legend.
And I know that they all have enormous respect for them, but they not necessarily liked him, correct?
Right. Especially in the racing day. Guys like Al Unser, who, I talked to Al for 2 hours. It was during COVID. It was one of those interviews I was really concerned about doing because he has a reputation for not being very talkative.
Right.
But we started talking about AJ, and he just went on and on and on. And they had clashed at different times. AJ gave Al his start in IndyCar racing. Really, Al feels like AJ saved his career at Indianapolis. But they clashed later. But now there's nothing but love. Nothing but love.
Wow, amazing. I know there are surprises that pop up, and we're going to talk about the major one that you uncovered, obviously the Riverside story. Can you tell our listeners that story in the rich detail that you describe it in the book?
The story had always been that AJ had this terrible crash in a stock car at Riverside in 1965, went end over end. His brakes had failed, and rather than slamming into Junior Johnson, he had pulled off the course and went end over end. He ended up hanging in his seat, and supposedly, as a story had gone that I had always heard, the first medic who got there said, "Don't bother, he's dead." Parnelli Jones is standing there. Jones had been in the race earlier, dropped out, had run over, and was looking in the car. So the story goes, and saw some movement, climbed in the car, pulled dirt out of AJ's mouth, and AJ obviously survived. In doing some research, it turns out that story just wasn't true. And nonetheless, and Parnelli Jones says it's not true. And really, it was in one of Parnelli's bios that I first saw this. And then in talking to the author, Bones Brochure wrote that book. He said, yeah, AJ was adamant that never happened, which never got a whole lot of attention. So that's just one of the things that, the lore of the legend sometimes outgrows the actual facts of what happened in the case.
But never happened. That's incredible.
Parnelli says, I was there. And even you go back and see the reporting from the day. none of the stories from the day had any mention of Parnelli Jones climbing in the car and pulling dirt out of his mouth. And certainly, if that had happened, somebody, whether Bob Thomas, I don't know if you remember Bob Thomas,
of course,
the Nissan PR guy, was the reporter from the LA Times at the time. And he was with Parnelli. They rode over on a scooter together to the accident. And he's the one who wrote the story. No mention of Parnelli Jones. So obviously, it never happened.
Was there anything, Art, that you felt AJ wished that he would have accomplished but didn't? I mean, there's kind of only one major circuit or racing series that he didn't succeed in, and that would be Formula One. Mm-hmm. Did you get a sense of that?
No, not that he regretted not driving a Formula One. I got the feeling that he had no regrets about that. He had an opportunity to race with Ferrari in Formula One and turned it down. Although Ferrari announced that it was going to happen, Foyt was back in Houston when the announcement came out, and it never did happen. But he says, I'm an American race driver. If I'm going to be successful in Formula One, I need to go over to Europe and race there for a few years so I know the circuits and I can be competitive. He says, I'm not willing to spend that much time away from the United States. I'm an American driver. Indianapolis made AJ Foyt, and I'll always be racing in Indianapolis, and that's first and foremost.
Yeah, interesting. So no, even though he obviously raced at Le Mans, he considered that a completely different exercise.
Yeah, yep, absolutely. And and he'd always say that, I beat all those Europeans in Indianapolis. I didn't need to go to Europe to beat them too. I won at Le Mans, so I don't need to go over and prove myself in Formula One.
Right. How about the friends and the drivers? It was such an era of people dying on the track. How about in your conversations with him and in your research in this book, how much did that affect him?
I was always amazed at how little it affected him. And he says early on that, I learned at my first Indy 500 not to get too close to the drivers. You didn't want to become friendly. A driver who had kind of mentored him in his first Indy 500 was killed on the first lap in 1958. And AJ said, I learned right then, don't get close to any other driver. And he says, they probably thought I was stuck up, but at the same time, I couldn't race with them and become really good friends with them, knowing that any of us could be killed at any moment.
Right. Yeah.
And there was one race at Ascot Park, and I forget exactly what year it was, where two drivers are killed on a Saturday night. AJ loads up his car, drives up to Sacramento the next day, wins a race in Sacramento. And I asked him, how did you guys do that? Because he wasn't the only one who was able to do that. But I said, how did you do that? And he had a surprised look on his face, like, that's what we did. It was my job. I needed the money. It was just what they did back then. It's amazing.
Yeah, amazing. Present day, what I've read about is that when you had the chance to interview him, and you just referenced it earlier, being with him, he's still a larger than life figure out there in Texas, isn't he? And tell us a little bit about how you spent time with him. And I know that there's a story of you going over to one of the ranches in the area. Tell us a little bit about modern AJ.
Modern, he is still bigger than life. When you go to Indianapolis, and I've been the last 5 years basically, and kind of hanging out in his garage, it's just one person after another rolling through the garage and talking to, just calling on the king basically, and coming to pay their dues with AJ. In Texas, when he was out driving, and he has a bunch of ranches in the area, very proud of what he's accomplished with those ranches. He's rebuilt and sold some of them. Some of them he still has. We went by one of his ranches, and he was concerned that there was a young calf there, and whose mother was down. It hadn't gotten up from giving birth. and AJ was obviously very concerned about that and how they were going to get that cow up and moving again. So it's part of what makes up AJ Foyt.
Yeah, amazing. This is volume 1 that has been published. There is a volume 2 to come, which will be next year. Is that correct, Art?
May of 2026 is our target if the writer can meet his deadlines.
Right. Tell me how volume 2 will pick up from volume 1, and will it be the same size? Because volume 1 certainly will keep any flying papers in a windstorm held down.
That's true. I'm hoping it won't be, but it's kind of trending that way. Though don't tell my publisher just yet. It's I'm probably halfway, probably more than that through it, and there's still a lot there. It's amazing how many drivers AJ mentored when he became a car owner. Robbie Gordon, Mike Groff, Brian Herta, and it goes on and on and on. In the stories of AJ and his son Larry and his grandson AJ the fourth, are pretty remarkable in their own right. So even while he's not driving, some of those stories are pretty incredible.
Yeah, right. When you think about the project now, having one book complete, the other one almost complete, what is it about trying to chronicle one of these legends that is so challenging?
One, there's just so much there.
Right.
And I'm constantly asking myself, does this really need to be in there? Given the size of this first book, there are probably some things that maybe shouldn't have been, but I have a hard time pulling anything out. And in fact, when I talked to the editors, I said, you tell me, what can we take out here? My main goal was not to have AJ Foyt fans say, well, what about this? How come that's not in there? What about that? I wanted to cover everything AJ had accomplished and surprise those AJ Foyt fans with some of the stories in the book. And volume 2 is going to be the same way.
Yeah. Your own history. For those who aren't aware, and I don't know if you shared this with AJ or not, but I found out that you raced vehicles as well back in the mid 70s. It was a short career, and I know you don't talk about it a lot, but you had a Mustang that you raced in the showroom stock category, which was in the SECA, correct?
Correct.
Give me a little bit of that history, and can you relate to AJ better now that you have that background?
Well, I did have a showroom stock Mustang for 1 year. Won a race at Nelson Ledges down in Ohio. Finished second at Indianapolis Raceway Park in another. Had a couple of good runs, and then I rolled it up in a little ball up in Waterford, outside Detroit. A little track there. I had raced enough to know I was never going to be another AJ Foyt. I found that out in a hurry. And that was the end of my driving career. I stuck to writing after that.
Right. And your history is one that winds its way through the automotive community. Tell us a little bit about how you spent your 40 years in the automotive world.
Yeah, I was a journalism major at Michigan State. Went to work on a newspaper down in Atlanta after that. Covered a lot of things, including auto racing, down there as a sports writer. Went to Ford in employee communications on their newspaper. Ford World News was what it was called. Got laid off at Ford. My boss happened to know a guy out of Toyota, and I got a job at Toyota in Torrance, California. I'd never been west of Chicago at the time. And at the time, Toyota was selling, 20,000 cars a month.
Wow.
Yeah, it was very small. It was mostly trucks at the time. I spent 15 years there, was part of the Lexus launch program, which was a great 5 years there. Went to Honda for 10 years, then back to Toyota, to the PR agency. And just had a great time. Auto racing was often part of, my responsibility. I never really did it directly, but people I worked with were doing it. So I got to go to Indianapolis a lot with both Toyota and Honda. When Toyota started stock car racing, I went to a lot of NASCAR races with them. So racing had always been an interest. My first race was Watkins Glen in '67, I think. My dad had worked for Ford. He'd been transferred from the tractor division to Autolite, which was they had just purchased, and was big into racing. So he was all of a sudden going to racing. It was just a job for him, but I kind of fell in love with it. And that's really what led to everything else, my focus on auto racing ever since.
Your focus on auto racing, your time in the auto industry, and you've been around all the big personalities. This show is Cars and Culture, and we've had 197 other guests on this program, many of whom have formed the fabric of culture around the world. What is it about automotive that is so stirring for those who are in it? And really, what is it about the culture that's created? You're part of culture now too. I mean, the creation of this book and everything else, Art.
Well, one is just a love of cars, of automotive things. As a kid, everybody in our neighborhood, their dad seemed to work for one of the car companies or a parts supplier, and we would race our model cars and slot cars, and cars were just part of it. I can't explain that. Then there's a competitive nature. When you're working for a car company, when I worked for Toyota, I wanted to beat Honda. And when I worked for Honda, I wanted to beat Toyota. And it's a company made out of competitive people. When I worked at Toyota, Bob McCurry was our top American executive. Bob was a two-time All-American football captain at Michigan State and extremely competitive. And that rubbed off in the entire company. You always wanted to be number one. And I think that's a driving culture. You want to be number one. And that's how racing ties in so well with it. It's a desire to win, basically.
Yeah, desire to win. You interview so many interesting people for this book. Is there another individual who's equally as fascinating as AJ that once volume 2 has been put to bed that you may be interested in talking to more?
I've kind of thought that maybe I would try to get outside the comfort zone and do something entirely different. Something like on a Tom Petty, rock and roll, who I was a big Tom Petty fan. Something like that, completely outside the comfort zone. Now, I'm 72. I'm not sure I'm going to do anything when this one's done, but we'll see. I can't imagine myself not writing because I enjoy it so much, even if it's just for myself.
Right. Yeah. A couple more AJ stories to close out our time here together. There was a really interesting part of the book where, a lot of people know about AJ's success on the track, but they don't know that he wasn't necessarily a great driver from the start and struggled a great deal in the mid 50s. Can you talk about the rolling pennies story?
Oh yeah, there's a couple of great stories from early on. Before he'd won a few races, but not much. And this was USAC had something called the Tangerine Series down in Florida for midget drivers during the off season, basically. And AJ went down there with Lloyd Ruby and a couple other drivers, and he didn't win a thing. Didn't qualify for half the races. And when it came time to come home, he didn't have enough money for gas. So he called his mom, who was very active in played penny ante poker every Friday with the neighborhood ladies. And his mom rolled up $50 worth of pennies and sent it to him by express. I forget what they called it back then. And so he would have enough money to pay for the trip home.
Wow.
Another story is he's married to his wife, Lucy, and they have a young child, about a year old. He's racing in a midget race in Detroit, fails to qualify. They have, again, basically no money they decide to drive straight through to Houston. They stop and buy a hamburger for their son, the 1-year-old son, to eat, and then drive straight through to Houston. And on that drive home, they talk about their future, and they decide that Lucy will stay home and raise the kids and do what she can to help AJ while he will go out on the racing circuit. And that's the way they lived the rest of their life. She would go to Indianapolis, but that would basically be the only race she would go to. And AJ would be gone most of the time on the racing circuits.
Yeah, incredible. Mario and Michael, as two examples, and obviously Al Unser Sr., Al Unser Jr., there's a lineage at times in the racing world. How did AJ feel about his sons perhaps not racing at the level that he did?
Well, AJ and mainly Lucy did not want their sons to race.
Did not.
Did not. AJ had been broken up enough. Beginning in 1965, had enough serious accidents where Lucy especially did not want their kids to race. One son, Tony, became a very good horse trainer, and that's what got AJ involved in horse racing. But when AJ was getting ready to retire, his youngest son, Jerry, decided that maybe Dad needs somebody to keep the name going. So he gave it a try, but AJ gave him no support, no help, no financial support at all. Jerry was on his own, and he said he had a great time. He had a lot of fun racing tracks all over America, but never really, made it in racing. Now, AJ's adopted son and his natural grandson, Larry, did try to race with his mom's blessing, with Lucy's blessing. And AJ said that's the only reason he was able to get on the track was that his mom, Lucy, had said it was okay. By then she had weakened a little bit, I guess. And now Larry's the president of AJ Foyt Racing.
Right. And the tradition continues in some form.
Yeah. Yep. And AJ Foyt the fourth, AJ's grandson, had a meteoric career, basically. Dominated Indy lights, but never was able to make the jump into Indy cars. And maybe he was too old. Maybe they pushed him too fast. He was 19 years old when he qualified in Indianapolis. So maybe there's a feeling that maybe they pushed him too fast, and eventually, he eventually retired at a very, very young age.
Did AJ give you his thoughts on the current state of racing?
Yeah, he doesn't think much of it. Spec cars. He's always talking about drivers not having as much fun as when he was, younger, driving 4 or 5 times a week and 4 or 5 different types of cars. He says drivers just don't know what that experience was like. The camaraderie, just the fun of competition and traveling from like a circus from track to track with other drivers. He said drivers don't appreciate that. Now, he's all for the safety improvements, 1,000%. He says they're 1,000% safer than when he was driving. And he said that's the best thing about racing today. But, he doesn't think the drivers are tough enough or that they're having enough fun.
Yeah. And I know he's had 4 or 5 different favorite race cars, but he kind of always keeps coming back to that fourth 500, doesn't he? The one in 77.
Correct. Yeah, that's a car that he built, with his dad and with his crew. They had a Foyt engine, formerly a Ford engine, that he had done a lot of work on, and his dad was a crew chief. So yeah, that's his favorite car.
Yeah, I guess at the end of it, Art, you sort of feel that you've become one with AJ Foyt. I'm guessing, right?
It's tough not to feel that way. You spend so much time around the guy, you realize, you know how great he was going in, but you think how great he was going in. you spend some time around him and you realize that's just scraping the surface. He had done a lot more than I ever imagined beforehand. And what he's been through in life at 90 years old is pretty incredible. Just amazing.
Well, and we didn't even mention it, but most might not know that, okay, he's 90. 85 years ago, you mentioned this briefly earlier, 85 years ago, he challenged a professional racer to an impromptu match race and won. Whether he was let to win or what have you, but he was 5 years old and he won the race, and he won everything after that, right?
Yeah, that picture of determination on his face as a 5-year-old is incredible. He's ready to go. 5 years old, and you just knew he was going to be a winner. Although he always said, I didn't think I'd live past 21 because he was so driven. You just could get the feeling that from that picture that he was going to be a winner.
And I would say, too, a complicated winner, right?
Oh, yeah. There's no doubt. Jekyll and Hyde, driven to win, wants everything that goes with it. But then once he gets it, backs away from, the autographs, from the fans. He loves to have the fans cheering for him, but he doesn't want to really spend a whole lot of time with them. Although even now, in his garage at Indianapolis, a huge crowd always is around the outside of the garage area when he's inside. And he'll be looking out there and he'll be saying, what do those people want? And, all this and complaining. And then he'll go out and sign autographs for as long as he can stand. And for a guy who's had both his legs crushed in racing accidents, just standing is hard for him at times. But he's out there and he's signing autographs as long as he can.
Octane Press is the publisher, and I think Mario Andretti says it all on the leaf of the book. AJ fans will love this book, and if anywhere in these pages it says AJ hates me, I know he doesn't anymore. That was a few decades ago, and today we're best friends forever, or as Mario says, BFFs. He is Art Garner. Survivor Champion Legend is the book. Volume 1, AJ Foyt. Once again, Octane Press. It's good to have a fellow journalist and a fellow automotive industry guy on with me here today talking about his new book. Congratulations again, Art Garner, on what you've done. We look forward to Volume 2 next year.
Thanks, Jason. I really appreciate you having me on.
Thank you for being on, Art.
You bet.